May 7th, 1864, the wilderness of Virginia. Midnight. The woods are still burning, not everywhere, just enough to make the darkness flicker like something alive. Low flames creep through dry leaves and pine straw. Smoke hangs beneath the trees in dirty blue layers. It stings the eyes. It catches in the throat. The ground is soft with churned mud, spilled blood, broken muskets, torn haversacks, smashed cartridge boxes, and men who will never stand up again. Somewhere in the black timber, wounded soldiers are still crying for water. Somewhere else, a horse is screaming in a voice so human it makes hardened veterans stop and listen. This is not silence after battle. This is what battle sounds like when it refuses to end. Near a lantern on a rough field table, Robert Edward Lee bends over paper and begins to write. Not a proclamation, not a victory speech, not one of those calm, polished letters that seem to belong to another age and another man. A warning. Because tonight, for the first time, Lee understands something he has never had to understand before. The army facing him is not going back. For 3 years in Virginia, every Union commander had eventually given Lee what he needed most: time, a pause, a retreat, a moment to breathe, reorganize, and live to fight on his own terms. McClellan had hesitated, Burnside had bled and recoiled, Hooker had boasted and then folded. Even Meade, after Gettysburg, had not finished him. Lee had built his legend not only by brilliance and audacity, but by sensing exactly when a Union commander had reached the edge of his nerve. But Grant is different. Grant has crossed the Rapidan. Grant has taken appalling losses. Grant has been mauled in the thickets and smoke of the wilderness. And yet tonight, instead of withdrawing north as every sane rule of this war suggests he should, he is moving again. South, toward Spotsylvania Courthouse, toward Richmond, toward Lee. And as Lee writes in the smoky darkness, he realizes that this campaign is not going to be one battle, or two, or even a season of maneuver. It is going to be a machine that keeps advancing no matter how much blood is poured into it. That realization begins with the smell of pine and fire. But to understand why this letter matters, you have to go back before the smoke, before the screams, before Grant. Back to the deep, dangerous confidence of the Army of Northern Virginia in the spring of 1864. Lee's men are exhausted, hungry, poorly clothed, and outnumbered. But they are also something else. They are convinced that they fight under the greatest commander on either side. Convinced that in Virginia, on familiar ground against the Army of the Potomac, Lee can still do what he has done before. Strike first, strike hard, terrify the enemy command, turn confusion into victory. Even Lee's senior officers, for all their scars and private doubts, still live inside that belief. James Longstreet, back from the west, is the old warhorse. Richard Ewell commands Stonewall Jackson's old corps, though he wears that inheritance uneasily. A.P. Hill is brilliant, reckless, and often sick, but still dangerous. Jeb Stuart still rides as if war itself were a form of theater. Around them, staff officers and aides move with the quiet arrogance of men who have survived too much to believe easily in defeat. And then Ulysses S. Grant is sent east. The news changes the emotional temperature of everything. Grant is not a mystery to Longstreet. They had served together in Mexico. Longstreet knows his face, knows his style, knows that he is not one of those generals who needs to look magnificent in order to be deadly. Grant does not dazzle. He does not posture. He does not romance war. He grinds through it. That makes him harder to read and harder to intimidate. Longstreet sees it first and says the line that hangs over this whole campaign like a prophecy: "That man will fight us every day and every hour till the end of the war." It does not sound theatrical. It sounds weary, professional, like a soldier recognizing another soldier whose greatest strength is not brilliance, but refusal. Lee hears the warning. He understands it. But understanding a thing and feeling its full weight are not the same. Through April, the two armies study each other across the Rapidan. Lee watches the Federal camps, watches the stir of movement, watches the roads, watches for the shape of the coming storm. And all the while, Grant is planning a different kind of campaign. Not one aimed merely at taking Richmond, not one aimed at winning a singular glorious field. Grant's objective is Lee's army itself. Pin it, bleed it, force it to react, keep it under pressure until the Confederacy can no longer maneuver, no longer replace, no longer recover. This is new. Previous Union campaigns in Virginia had often treated Lee as a puzzle to be solved in one move. Grant treats Lee as a problem to be exhausted over time. That difference is everything. At dawn on May 4th, the Union Army starts south. Pontoon bridges go down across the Rapidan. Blue columns pour over Germanna Ford and Ely's Ford. The movement is immense, deliberate, unmistakable. More than 100,000 men. Guns, wagons, cavalry, ambulances, engineers. It is not a raid. It is the opening of a siege before the siege has even begun. Grant wants to get through the wilderness quickly. He knows the terrain is poison. A tangle of second-growth timber and underbrush left by old clear-cutting. It is bad country for artillery, bad country for cavalry, bad country for command and control. It blinds, it isolates, it confuses. A great Union army in open ground can use its numbers and guns. In the wilderness, it can only grope. Lee knows that too. So he does what he has always done when confronted with superior force. He attacks. It is an extraordinary decision, bold to the point of danger. He divides his already smaller army, sending Ewell on the Orange Turnpike, Hill on the Orange Plank Road, while Longstreet hurries up from the rear. The goal is simple and savage. Strike Grant before Grant can escape the forest. Smash into the marching columns while they are still entangled in roads and woods. Turn the terrain into a weapon. If Lee waits, Grant may reach open ground where Federal numbers become crushing. If Lee attacks in the wilderness, everything becomes chaotic, intimate, primitive. Lee is gambling that chaos favors him. The first collision comes on May 5th. On the Orange Turnpike, Warren's 5th Corps runs headlong into Ewell's line near Saunders Field. Men step out of timber into open ground and are met with a storm of musket fire. Lines stagger, reform, advance again, and vanish in smoke. On the Orange Plank Road, Getty and Hancock slam into A.P. Hill's front in a close-range nightmare where brigades drift sideways and commanders lose entire regiments in the brush. The wilderness devours formation. A soldier can hear firing 20 yards away and not know whether it is friend or enemy. Officers shout themselves hoarse and no one hears. The air smells of black powder, sweat, damp bark, and fresh blood. Muzzle flashes wink between tree trunks like malevolent eyes. Men fire at shapes. They die without seeing who killed them. And through all this, Lee watches for something he has seen so many times before. The moment when the Union commander decides he has had enough. It never comes. That fact reveals itself not in one dramatic scene, but in 100 little refusals. Grant does not panic. Grant does not freeze. Grant does not start thinking first about Washington and blame. Even when subordinates begin muttering in the old Army of the Potomac language, Lee might turn our flank, Lee might get in our rear, Lee might work one of his miracles, Grant snaps with irritation. He is tired, he says, of hearing what Lee is going to do. Let's think instead what we are going to do to him. It is a small verbal moment, but psychologically, it is enormous. For 3 years, Lee's greatest victories in Virginia had begun before the first decisive shot. They had begun in the minds of Federal generals who feared him so much that every move he made seemed bigger than it was. Grant will not give him that advantage. He refuses to worship Lee. He refuses even to center him. That alone alters the chemistry of the battlefield. By nightfall on May 5th, the fighting has settled into a smoking, unresolved horror. Neither side has won. Both have bled. Fires start in the underbrush and begin creeping toward the wounded. Darkness does not end the danger, it only makes it worse. Men lie in agony between the lines while sparks drift overhead. Officers huddle with maps they can barely read. Messengers stumble through the dark trying to find headquarters that may already have moved. On Lee's side, there is no true rest. Hill's men are spent. Longstreet is still hurrying up. The line is fragile. Everything depends on morning. Morning comes with catastrophe. At first light on May 6th, Hancock attacks Hill's exhausted corps with overwhelming force. The Confederate line buckles almost at once. Units begin to give ground. The pressure is enormous. For a few terrifying moments, it looks as if the Army of Northern Virginia's right will simply come apart in the woods. This is the first great crisis of Grant and Lee's direct collision, and this is where Lee's personal legend nearly gets him killed. Longstreet arrives just in time, his leading brigade slamming into the fight like a door thrown shut against disaster. Gregg's Texans move forward. Lee rides behind them, his blood up. Too far forward, driven by that dangerous instinct of his to personally place himself at the hinge of battle. The men see him and erupt. Lee to the rear! Lee to the rear! They are not cheering, they are begging, grabbing reins, reaching for his boots, pulling him back because if Lee dies here, amid smoke and brush and panic, the Confederacy may die with him. Longstreet stabilizes the line. Then he counterattacks brilliantly, finding a concealed unfinished railroad cut and using it to drive into Hancock's flank. The battle swings again. The Union left reels. It is exactly the kind of tactical recovery Lee has built his reputation on: speed, improvisation, nerve. And then, just as Confederate momentum surges, fate strikes with its cruelest irony. Longstreet is hit by friendly fire. Another accidental wounding, another irreplaceable lieutenant carried off the field at the very moment of opportunity. The Woods do not care about genius. They swallow it the same way they swallow privates. By afternoon, the Wilderness is a vision from the end of the world. Fire runs through dry brush. Wounded men scream from the flames. Trees smolder. The dead lie in heaps around breastworks and along the roads. Gordon attacks on the Confederate left late in the day and drives part of the Union line back. Elsewhere, Hill and Ewell hold. There are local triumphs, local disasters, but no clean decision. Nothing feels settled. The whole battlefield seems to vibrate with unfinished violence. And this matters more than any tactical map can show, because Lee has always understood war as a conversation between pressure and morale. A battle is not won merely by inflicting loss. It is won when the enemy's will recoils, when his command structure starts cracking, when he begins to preserve himself rather than pursue the objective. Grant is not doing that. So when darkness falls on May 6th, Lee's headquarters is not triumphant. It is tense. Exhausted staff officers bring reports through smoke and mud. Couriers come and go at all hours. Somewhere nearby, wounded men are being cut apart by surgeons. Somewhere farther back, ammunition trains are trying to sort themselves on impossible roads. The whole army is bruised, frayed, short of certainty. Yet beneath all of that is one central question. Will Grant retreat? Every previous major Union commander in Virginia would have. After a bloody, inconclusive, disorienting battle against Lee in this terrain, after losses on this scale, the standard response would be to pull back north of the Rapidan, regroup, write dispatches, and explain why the offensive must pause. Lee expects it enough to think in those terms. Not because he underestimates Grant, but because the Army of the Potomac has trained everyone on both sides to expect retreat after shock. Then the reports begin to change. Not much at first. Hints, movements, road traffic, engineers ordered to take up bridges, course shifting, cavalry probing southward. The roads no longer feel like roads of withdrawal. They feel like roads of movement, southward movement, toward Spotsylvania, toward the left, toward Richmond. And in that moment, somewhere in the wet, black hours between the Wilderness and Spotsylvania, Lee understands that Longstreet's warning was not merely a judgment of character. It was the operating principle of the entire campaign. That man will fight us every day and every hour till the end of the war. Now comes the letter. Lee writes to Jefferson Davis in the aftermath of the Wilderness, not with the tone of a man who believes one more hard blow has solved everything, but with the tone of a commander suddenly forced into a new reality. He reports the fighting, the heavy pressure, the enemy's movement, the need to respond quickly. The letter is part battlefield report, part strategic warning. Its surface is calm, professional, measured. Lee does not dramatize himself, he never does. But under that controlled language is the realization that the old war in Virginia has ended. The enemy has not been thrown back. The enemy is moving again, and every mile south matters. This is why that letter, more than any ceremonial surrender note months later, feels like Lee's true last letter, because it is the last letter written before the old assumptions finally die. The last letter before Lee fully understands that he is no longer fighting to repel campaigns, but to survive one unending campaign. He wastes no time. If Grant is racing for Spotsylvania Courthouse, Lee must beat him there. With Longstreet down, Richard H. Anderson takes command of First Corps and is pushed hard through the night. It is one of the most urgent marches of the war. Confederate columns stumble through darkness, brush, crossroads, confusion, and fatigue with a single purpose: to get between Grant and Richmond before dawn does. Anderson gets there just in time. That phrase, just in time, will define almost everything about Lee's relationship with Grant from this point forward. At Spotsylvania, the armies slam together again. Not after a month, not after a season, immediately. The wilderness has barely finished burning, and already there is another battlefield. That alone is revolutionary. Grant is not treating the wilderness as a concluded event. He is treating it as one engagement in a chain. That means Lee cannot rest, cannot rebuild comfortably, cannot savor tactical success. Every Confederate recovery now takes place under pursuit. The fighting at Spotsylvania is even more brutal in some ways because it strips away the illusion that the wilderness was a one-time nightmare. It was the opening act. Rain, mud, spades, breastworks, salients, failed assaults, constant movement left and south. Every time Grant is checked, he slides. Every time Lee blocks him, Grant shifts again. It becomes a war of angle and endurance. The grand theater of earlier campaigns starts to die. What replaces it is uglier, more modern, more relentless. Then comes May 12th, the bloody angle. Before dawn, Hancock's men crash into the Muleshoe salient in a storm, overrunning much of the Confederate position in one of the war's most devastating surprise attacks. Entire brigades are captured. Guns are seized. The line bends toward catastrophe. Lee rides into the maelstrom again, trying to rally men, trying to stem the rupture. For nearly 20 hours, the fight degenerates into savage, face-to-face killing in the rain. Men fire over breastworks at distances so close they scorch one another's clothes. Trees 18 inches thick are chewed through by musket balls. The trenches fill with blood and water and shattered bodies. This is the moment when Grant's design becomes unmistakable. He is not searching for a perfect battlefield. He is manufacturing cumulative destruction. Even when his attacks fail, the pressure remains. Even when Lee responds brilliantly, the next crisis arrives before the army has fully recovered from the last one. The Confederate High Command begins living from emergency to emergency, never sure which blow is the main blow and which one is only setting up the next. This is what keeps Lee writing, not because he is breaking publicly, he never does, but because every dispatch now carries a weight that older dispatches did not. They are no longer reports on isolated fields. They are updates in an ongoing siege of motion, a war in which the Army of Northern Virginia must survive not one Union commander's ambition, but one Union commander's refusal to stop. Lee's aides feel it too. Walter Taylor, efficient, intelligent, deeply loyal, tries to make sense of Grant in his own letters. At first, he dismisses him, calls him overrated, sees him as a brute, a man willing to spend lives in horrific quantities. But even Taylor cannot avoid the core truth. Grant holds on longer than any of them. That is the sentence that matters. Not the contempt, the admission. He holds on longer. Longer than McClellan, longer than Burnside, longer than Hooker, longer than the Army of Northern Virginia's emotional model of the Union war machine had prepared for. And so the letter Lee wrote that night in the wilderness becomes, in retrospect, the hinge of everything that followed. Because it was not really about the wilderness. It was about what came after the wilderness. North Anna, Totopotomoy, Cold Harbor, the James River, Petersburg. Each one different in terrain, different in tactics, different in immediate result, but all part of the same uninterrupted reality first felt in the smoke of early May. Grant would absorb losses, sidestep, march, and hit again. At North Anna, Lee devised a brilliant defensive position that might have punished a more reckless or more psychologically shaken opponent. Grant probed, paused, then moved again. At Cold Harbor, Lee inflicted one of the ugliest tactical defeats of the war on the Union Army. Another Federal commander might have let such slaughter end the whole campaign. Grant did not. He shifted yet again, crossing the James River in one of the boldest operational movements of the war and driving toward Petersburg. That is what the letter in the wilderness truly foresaw, even if Lee could not yet see every stop on the road. It foresaw a commander who would not define success or failure the old way. For Lee, who had spent much of the war mastering the emotional vulnerabilities of his opponents, this was the deepest shock. Grant's army could lose more men and still advance. It could be bloodied and still dictate movement. It could suffer tactical repulse without surrendering strategic initiative. That changed the mathematics of hope for the Confederacy. And once hope changes, sleep changes with it. Men can sleep after victory. Men can even sleep after defeat if they believe defeat has limits. What they cannot sleep through is continuity. The knowledge that dawn will not bring a pause, only another collision. That is the psychological core of the Overland Campaign. It was not just a contest of armies, it was a contest of nervous systems. Grant's nervous system could absorb horror and keep functioning. Lee's command structure, magnificent though it often was, depended on creating operational pauses through tactical violence. When Grant denied those pauses, he did not merely challenge Lee's army, he overworked it. He forced it to live in a state of permanent emergency. Each success became thinner, each recovery shorter, each letter home darker. The Confederacy was not defeated in spirit that night in the wilderness. Lee still believed he could fight, still believed he could maneuver, still believed his army could inflict terrible damage. All of that was true. But what died that night was something subtler and perhaps more important: the belief that one hard battle in Virginia would send the Union backward. When Lee bent over that paper by lantern light and wrote his report after the wilderness, he was not surrendering. He was doing something much more painful for a commander of his gifts. He was adjusting to a new enemy, adjusting to a new war, adjusting to the fact that tactical brilliance alone would no longer buy enough time. That is why the letter matters, because by the time Lee wrote his famous surrender correspondence in April 1865, the ending had already been in motion for almost a year. The real psychological break came not at Appomattox, but in the smoke-blackened hours after the wilderness, when Lee first understood that Grant's campaign was not made of separate battles. It was a rolling pressure system, a human siege, an iron machine with one grim instruction: keep going. The night was wet, the lantern was low. The woods still burned around him. Men still cried out in the darkness. Couriers still came in with mud on their boots and smoke on their coats. Somewhere nearby, surgeons still worked over candlelight. Somewhere farther off, Grant's columns were already beginning to turn south, and Lee wrote, calmly, professionally, without self-pity, without drama, but also without illusion. Because for the first time in the war against the Army of the Potomac, he was facing a man who would not be content to lose beautifully or retreat prudently or pause respectfully after bloodshed. He was facing a man who would simply keep coming. And once Lee understood that, everything that followed, Spotsylvania, the trenches, Petersburg, the long tightening grip around Richmond, was already there in outline, waiting inside the smoke. The last letter was not the last thing Lee ever wrote. It was the last letter he wrote before he understood that the old rules were gone. And in war, sometimes that is the real ending, not the surrender, not the silence. The moment a great commander reads the future in the dark and realizes he cannot stop it.